Well, I want to simply add my thanks to all of the other speakers, to the organizers of this wonderful exhibition, to Gabriele and to Miguel and to Paul and to Tom. There's Tom over there. And also for, I think, a wonderful symposium. I wish that I could be the final fireworks, but I'm more prosaic than that. No, I've written this paper in response to Miguel Palomir's request, which I take to be an assignment, that I say something about Raphael's legacy in Italy, circa 1600, which is to say at about the time of the unveiling of Annibale Carracci's great masterwork in the Farnese Gallery, and with it the definitive triumph of the Carracci reform of painting in Rome. And before beginning, I must apologize to you for violating art historical custom by not illustrating my general argument with slides or PowerPoint, for the simple reason that my assignment is to speak broadly about the changing status of Raphael in art criticism, rather than to illustrate particular examples of his influence upon later painters. And these influences are virtually infinite, as you all know. Raphael has always been ranked at the very pinnacle of artistic achievement. But at the same time, the particular reasons, the expressive values justifying that ranking have changed considerably over time. Put simply, Raphael in the 17th century is not the same Raphael as he was in the 16th century, nor is he the same Raphael as he was in the 18th century and in the 19th century. For Vasari in 1568, Raphael was certainly a major painter, but he was still a human being. And he was second, indeed, to Michelangelo as one of the founders and great practitioners of what was called the Maniera Moderna for Vasari. By the time of Bologna's Vitae in 1672, Raphael had achieved a near apotheosis, a near deification as a supreme master of a classic style which was identifiable simultaneously with the art of ancient Rome and its recovery, which occurred also in Rome in the very first decades of the 16th century, the era we call the High Renaissance. Raphael and antiquity were for Bologna the foundations for the reform of art achieved by Annibale Carracci and then reaffirmed at the end of the century by Carlo Maratta. During the Seicento, at the same time, Michelangelo's reputation had simultaneously suffered a precipitous decline, as Jacques Tuillier, the late lamented Jacques Tuillier, showed long ago, to the point that Malvasia's ill-judged rhetorical sally, calling Raphael a bocalaio urbinate, is still received with, I have to say, rather prissy outrage as a species of lèse-majesté or even outright blasphemy, while Malvasia's further bon mot in the very same sentence that Michelangelo painted a giudizio senza giudizio has scarcely lifted an eyebrow. The apotheosis of Raphael then reached its absolute completion with Winckelmann in the 18th century. For Winckelmann, Raphael had achieved an artistic or an aesthetic and indeed a moral status all but equal to that of the ancient Greeks, of whom Raphael was the true heir, and with his death, art declined from this breathtaking height. The painting of the Carracci, in Winckelmann's view, was itself an art in decline, and Malvasia was no more, in his words, than a mere chatterbox, lacking the capacity to distinguish the beautiful from the mediocre. Talk about lèse-majesté, but you don't get more majestic than Winckelmann. Winckelmann's Raphael is the Raphael of Wolflin's klassischer Idealstil, as well as the Raphael of Panofsky's vision of the unification of classical form, or pathos, with ethical content, or ethos, which for Panofsky defined the Renaissance itself. It is also the Raphael of Gombrich's supreme classical solution, as he called it, as he saw this in particular in the Sistine Madonna, which for him evinced a permanent norm, an absolute truth, as set against the variable contingencies of all other styles in art. I will not comment further upon this, except to say that the weaknesses of Gombrich's concept of a classical norm have been thoroughly exposed by Hans Belting. Now, to return to Annibale Carracci and Raphael's legacy in Italy circa 1600, the seeds of the Carracci reform had, of course, been sown in their academy in Bologna during the 1580s and the 1590s. The linguistic parallel between the reform of painting and the reform of the church is not fortuitous. In both instances, the root meaning of reform is that of a return to first principles. Church reform meant renewed study of the teaching of the early fathers and the practices of the early church. Painterly reform meant renewed study of the fundamentals of painting, that is, disegno, colore, chiaroscuro, invenzione, and so on, all of which had been individually perfected in the first decades of the Cinquecento, but in all of which no single artist excelled. After those heroic early years, painting had fallen into a precipitous decline, simply repeating the outworn formulas of a fantastic and often licentious mannerism, especially practiced by such Roman, Florentine, and Bolognese followers of Michelangelo and Raphael as Bronzino, Salviati, Sabatini, and so on. The Carracci upheld Raphael and Michelangelo themselves as worthy models, but even so perceived their styles to be incomplete. First principles in painting certainly included mastery of an idealist disegno, in which the Florentine Michelangelo excelled. But they also embraced the naturalistic effects of light and shadow, the chiaroscuro at which the Venetian Titian was unequaled. And they further included mastery of pure and unadulterated hues, the bright, sunlit colors for which the Lombard Correggio was unrivaled. Even Vasari had acknowledged that Michelangelo's color, based in the long, out-of-date ornamental conventions of the Quattrocento, was wanting, while Titian and the Venetians generally were notorious for masking weaknesses in drawing beneath the seductively dramatic shadowing. For Vasari, the fundamentals of painting had been essentially bipolar. That is to say, he opposed an idealizing Tuscan disegno on the one hand versus a naturalizing Venetian colore, ideal versus nature, in other words. The Carracci were the first to articulate a distinction between chiaroscuro, in which the Venetians did indeed excel, and colori, identifiable not with Venice, but with the artists of the Lombard plain, from Francia and Costa in their native Emilia, native Bologna, and including Perugino and the young Urbinate Raphael, both of whom had been close to Francia and were painters of important works in Bologna. Also continuing for the Carracci to painters like Bernardino Campi and Cremona, a famous colorist, and above all, in the end, fundamentally to the more modern Correggio in Parma. Francia and Costa's softly atmospheric fusions and their sweetly affective colorism were perceived as the foundation for their maniera devota, which we've heard about from Bob LaFrance this morning, or the devout style, despised by Michelangelo as suitable only for ignorant women and monks, but not for those who truly understood and valued art. Vasari also loathed the maniera devota, as well as the Bolognese painters in general, whom he resented for criticizing his own work painted in Bologna, as well as for their obtuse resistance to the maniera moderna. Even as he acknowledged that the early Raphael, with his coronation of the Virgin in 1504, had established himself as the greatest master of the maniera devota, surpassing even his master Perugino. Parenthetically, in my opinion, the young Raphael's relations with Francia, which were undoubtedly close, still have yet to be understood completely, and that's why I was thrilled to hear Bob LaFrance this morning, though talking about Timoteo Viti, but it's the same problem. But this circumstance, this undervaluation, I think, of Bolognese Cinquecento art is attributable in part, in fact, more than in part, to the loss of early paintings by the young Raphael, owned by Agamennone de Grassi, and by the Bentivoglio in Bologna, destroyed with their palace when the Bentivoglio were expelled in 1506. For the Carracci, however, coming to maturity in the Bologna of Cardinal Paleotti and the full tide of the Counter-Reformation, when the purposes of art in reinforcing the faith were of paramount concern, the affective values of the devout style were once again matters of central importance. These were values, above all, identified with a persuasive verisimilitude, true to the experiences of even the simplest viewer, a natural verisimilitude based in the effects of color. There could, however, be no question of a simple return to the old-fashioned conventions of Francia and the young Raphael after the stupendous achievements of the High Renaissance. And so, as we have seen, the Carracci turned above all to Correggio as a model for colori in painting. Raphael was not yet perceived to be the supreme normative model, but he rather exemplified the excellence of but one of the four great Italian schools, namely the Florentine, Roman, Venetian, and Lombard schools, with Raphael exemplifying the Roman. Raphael's virtues were double: perfected proportion and symmetry in drawing and composition, and mastery and sweetness in coloring, which I remember Carmen Bambach cited in her talk yesterday. As Vasari put it, Raphael, having put aside the devout style in which he was trained and seeking to remake himself as a painter in the maniera moderna, understood that no one could compete with Michelangelo in representing the nude figure. He therefore sought to make of himself a universal painter. master of qualities untested by Michelangelo or simply lacking in him, and this especially was in the natural effects of color, for which Raphael chose, oddly enough, I've always thought Fra Bartolomeo as a model. The conception of Raphael as a universal painter also set a precedent for the Carracci reform, leading them toward a critical definition, a systematic study, and an integration of the differing excellences of the four Italian schools. So far as Raphael himself was concerned, the model they chose was less that of the early Raphael than it was two famous paintings from his Roman period, both in Bologna and both here today in the Prado, that is to say, the Saint Cecilia in San Giovanni in Monte and the Vision of Ezekiel in the Ercolani collection. Both paintings were exemplars of proportion and heroic scale, and more important in a way, both exemplified Raphael's reformed coloristic sweetness and also truth to nature. It remains only to be added that notwithstanding Raphael's saturated hues at full intensity, so unlike his Roman Mannerist followers, Correggio's additional soft sfumato effects in the end provided the Carracci with a more completely natural, effective model. However, with the unveiling of Annibale's Farnese Gallery some 15 years later, a completely different picture of Raphael begins to emerge. According to the sources, a lively debate immediately broke out among artists, and presumably many of them Bolognese artists, over whether Annibale had been the better painter in Bologna or in Rome. And it soon became clear the debate turned on whether the celebrated Carracci reform of painting had first been fully achieved in Bologna or only later in Rome, after Annibale had absorbed the lessons of antiquity and Raphael, and indeed a very different Raphael, in particular the Raphael of the Stanze rather than the St. Cecilia or the Ezekiel. This debate is at the heart of the critical war fought by the two leading biographers of the Carracci, the Roman Giovan Battista Balori, who claimed Annibale for the school of Rome, and the Bolognese Count Carlo Cesare Malvasia, who argued not only for the priority of Bologna, but also for the importance of Annibale's cousin Ludovico Carracci in establishing the reform. Ludovico, who had never studied in Rome, but had contented himself with the assimilation of the naturalist excellencies of North Italian models. For Balori, the reform could not have been complete without the additional assimilation of the idealist Roman Raphael and his antique models. And indeed, as the century progressed, and this is very important, the style of Raphael and the values it represented came more and more to be identified with the values of the antique itself. Raphael and the antique are synonyms. Indeed, Raphael as a painter, especially as he was understood by a developing French criticism, articulated by painters and amateurs working in Rome or visiting Rome, from Poussin and Dufresnoy to Lebrun and Felibian, and strongly encouraged by the Francophile Balori, gradually assumed the status of a surrogate ancient. Raphael became a surrogate ancient. The style of Raphael was transformed into the antique and vice versa, and as such entered into the teaching of the newly founded French Academy, the Académie Royale in Paris, and its sister branch in Rome. This gradual assimilation of Raphael to the antique can even be traced by comparing Perrier's earlier compilation of especially admirable ancient statues in his Segmenta to those later compiled by Poussin's student, Pietro Santi Bartoli, in numerous exemplary publications, antiquarian publications devoted to the admiranda of ancient Rome, in which the ancient statues and paintings are rendered in a style unmistakably Raphaelesque. But here we must return to our primary subject, which is the legacy of Raphael at the time of the unveiling of Anibole's Farnese Gallery in 1601. The frescoes are devoted to a series of lyrical scherzi on the theme of love, specifically the loves of the pagan gods. They are constructed on an armature simultaneously based on Michelangelo's medallion supporting Ignudi in the Sistine Chapel and on multiple references to Raphael, especially to his frescoes in the Farnesina, the loggia of which takes the same theme as the one adopted by Annibale, namely the triumph of love in the universe. The citation of these illustrious forebears is so obvious and so witty as to make it clear that Annibale meant his ceiling to be seen in a conscious rivalry with the achievement of these Renaissance masters, precisely Michelangelo and Raphael. And it is no exaggeration to say that he succeeded brilliantly, so much so that the Farnese Gallery was immediately seen and is still seen today as the third crown in the great papal tiara of Roman frescoes, together with the Sistine Chapel of Michelangelo and the stanza together with the Farnesina of Raphael. With the gallery, in Bellori's estimation, Annibale had almost equaled, this is Bellori, almost equaled Raphael's perfect draftsmanship. But he had even surpassed Raphael in true-to-life coloring. And it is true that Annibale excelled his Renaissance rivals in filling his scenes with the pellucid light of day, which seems an extension of the natural light illuminating the room itself, and that unlike even Raphael, his nude figures, as Bellori also writes, seem clothed in soft, yielding flesh, covering the solid mass of muscle beneath the solid mass which in Michelangelo and Raphael is still too much apparent. Even for Bellori, Lombard colorism had triumphed in Rome and had forever become part of the artistic canon. Now I'll close with a brief addendum to Raphael's legacy in the early Seicento, which has to do not with his mastery of the antique as such, but with his reputation as the consummate master of grace. And as Miguel mentioned in his excellent talk, consummate master of grace and charm. Raphael's, it's hard quite to put your finger on this, but this grace and charm that is embodied in his colorism as well as his disegno. With Raphael's reputation as the consummate master of grace, referring especially to feminine grace. Just as Venus herself embodies perfect beauty, Venusta, so too she is always attended by the graces, who enhance that beauty. In other words, not mere bellezza, which is boring, but with an added salt of grace, bellezza becomes perfect beauty, or Venusta. It's not conventional beauty. Venus is always attended by the graces, who enhance her beauty with such added charms as blossoming youth or radiant splendor. Only 3 painters in the history of art have been singled out as supreme painters of grace, and these are the Greek Apelles, whom Pliny writes was the first to add an extra piquancy or salt to the simple portrayal of beauty, the salt of that grace or charis, for which Alexander Pope which for Alexander Pope was beyond the reach of art. The second is Raphael, especially as seen in the criticism of the 16th and earlier 17th centuries. And the third painter identified with grace is Guido Reni, the student of the Carracci. Reni's numerous debts to his great predecessor, and in his view rival, Raphael, beginning with the St. Cecilia, are well known, and I need not catalog them. Here I will only single out his fresco of Aurora in the Casino Rospigliosi, painted about 1614, in which Apollo drives his chariot of the sun out into the morning sky, led by Aurora and accompanied by the dancing hours, who taken together make up a veritable catalog of Raphaelesque prototypes. Guido had been trained in the Carracci Academy in Bologna and was thoroughly acquainted with the conventions for natural coloring developed there. And to the model of Raphael in his portrayal of the hours, he was able to add the glories of their softly roseate flesh and lightness as they dance in the pellucid morning air. In them, we see the prototypes for such figures as his portrayals of the penitent Magdalene, her alabaster skin flushed with rosy tints at the cheeks and lips, the pearls that she has cast aside, transformed seemingly miraculously into the tears that coursed down her cheek. In such images, Raphael's grace is transformed into a new and unmistakably Seicentesque form, an image of perfect earthly beauty, metamorphosed into the divine, an image beyond the reach even of Raphael himself. Thank you.